This being Earth Week, environmental activists are hopeful that many will focus their attention on climate change, which, although not an obvious problem, it is one they say is clearly having an impact on the Adirondacks. From extreme weather and shorter winter sports seasons to the threat of new invasive species and pests and changes in habitat for songbirds and wildlife, environmental advocates have found an ally in North Country Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who is one of just about 24 Republicans in the House of Representatives who is a member of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. At her recent town hall meeting, Stefanik took several questions on climate change, including concerns that climate change could become a national security issue.
Oftentimes people don't come at the climate change issue from a national security perspective, so I applaud you for raising the profile. One example where I think that we've shown real leadership is when the president, in terms of their national security strategy, got rid of climate change as one of the important factors, one of the important provisions when it comes to our overall strategy. I partnered with the ranking member, I'm head of the Emerging Threats Subcommittee, and we wrote a letter to the president on why that was not responsible and why we need to include climate change as we address national security challenges around the world.
The Congresswoman also said she is open to the idea of a carbon tax to try to force the nation to take action to combat climate change. Tim Palmer asked that question about a carbon tax at the Congresswoman's Town Hall in Mariah on April 6. Tim is the chair of the Plattsburgh Town Planning Board and founded the North Country chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. That's a nonpartisan advocacy group focused on addressing climate change. Welcome. It's nice to see you.
Thank you very much for having me here.
How much of an impact are we seeing from climate change here in the Adirondacks?
We're seeing an increase in precipitation, I think almost 3 inches over the last couple of decades. Some of the indicators that people might see of the actual raise in temperature, the lake hardly ever freezes over. At the turn of the century, it froze virtually every winter. And each successive year or decade, it freezes less and less frequently. There was a period of time just a few years ago, it went 7 winters without freezing over. That's a real obvious.
I think a lot of people are noticing maybe the temperatures, seeing the extreme weather that we've been having the last few years. Beyond that, what other sort of things are we seeing?
Well, there's going to be an effect on fishes, cold water fishes. Things like salmon and trout are dependent on snowmelt in streams, cold water. You know, some salmon will go almost 1,000 miles and 5,000 feet in altitude to find cold snowmelt. Eventually, soon, there won't be any cold snowmelt at all.
You're hoping to raise awareness to get people to pay more attention to climate change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to do something about it.
Is it not on people's radar? Is it that they see the ice melting in the Arctic and they understand that and they get that, but beyond that, they don't see obvious changes happening here, and therefore they're not paying attention?
It's not really part of the conversation in a way that, of course, I think it should be. The Arctic melt is a huge thing, and historically, in deep history, geological history, when the ice cap has gone, exposing all of that dark blue water, ice reflects almost 100% of incoming radiation, water absorbs almost all of it. That's obviously always produced an uptick in the warming of the planet, and we're very close to the edge of that now. But it's not commented on. We really don't get that much media about this huge thing that's happening.
And so for a lot of people, they're aware of it, but not making it a priority.
They may be aware of it. As primates, we're kind of into the immediate and maybe the near-term future. It's hard for us to think about long-term.
But people should be.
Oh, absolutely. I see it as a potential end for humanity.
You not only want to raise awareness, but your group works specifically with lawmakers.
Yes.
Primarily in Washington to try to come up with national policies to address climate change.
We're focused on the federal level, and we really are targeting a specific piece of legislation called carbon fee and dividend. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that we kind of are doing two things, and maybe the most important one is growing political will. So much of what we're about is bringing people into the process, and we're bringing people into the process not in the street democracy way, which is absolutely critical. Street democracy is absolutely critical, but we're actually going to the lawmakers and speaking with them politely, respectfully, and teaching them. And we're having remarkable success. I mean, the things that we are achieving, I never would have guessed that we could have done it. So yes, we want to pass see carbon fee and dividend legislation passed.
And let's pick up on that. What is a carbon tax?
When we burn fossil fuels, they do environmental damage, but the cost, that environmental cost, is not included in their price. There's free use of the atmosphere as a sewer. So the idea is by putting a fee on carbon fuels, you're wrapping the cost of that environmental damage in the price that's paid. So the most straightforward way to do it is to put the fee on fossil fuels where they enter the economy. So that means at the wellhead, at the mine, or where they come into the port. And you assess that on the basis of how much CO2 it's going to produce per unit of energy. So like coal produces about twice as much CO2 as natural gas. And so what that does, of course, it raises the cost of fossil fuel on everything downstream in the economy. The increase in price is going to be passed along. So the other sort of half of our proposal is to take those collected funds and distribute them in a monthly check or deposit in people's bank accounts, one equal share to each American.
So they would get a percentage of the tax money?
They would get 350 millionth or whatever. But it adds up to a significant amount of money. It could be a couple $1,000s a year.
To help offset what they would pay in higher energy costs.
Yes, exactly. And someone who is in the upper income scale spends a lot more money on goods that have embodied carbon energy in them, and so contribute much more to the kitty, as it were. They get the same $2,000 or whatever back as the person who's at the lower end of the economic scale. So about 60% of people at the lower end will come out ahead. They'll actually get more in the dividend than the additional cost in the things that they buy.
And the idea behind it is to, again, try to get us away from using fossil fuels so much and look to alternative
It's
sources.
a market-based mechanism, which is why it can appeal to both Democrats and Republicans.
What's been the response from lawmakers on Capitol Hill?
When you talk to Democrats, they always assume that there is no such thing as a Republican who would be interested in anything having to do with climate change. Even more interesting, perhaps, when you talk to Republicans, or at least when we used to talk to Republicans, what we would hear is there aren't any Republicans who are interested in climate change. But what we learned is that there are quite a few who are actually concerned. We would guess about 40%.
Really?
About 40%.
I think that might surprise a number of people.
I think it should.
Elise Stefanik, the
Absolutely.
Congresswoman here in the 21st District, is one of them.
Yes.
And she seems more engaged than many other Republicans.
We consider her a climate hero.
Why is that?
Well, she's in a party that will punish you pretty harshly for stepping out on climate issues. So when you have someone like Elise Stefanik, who is recognizing quite clearly that climate change is real, she's taking a risk. She's risking, and you can see it actually on her website and her Facebook page, for example. If she does something that's positive for the climate, the left says she's disingenuous, that this isn't real, that she's somehow gotten permission from her party to do this. And the right is likely to say, well, you should be a Democrat. So she really is caught in a crossfire when she does these things.
Has she told you why this is so important to her?
She believes in peer-reviewed science, so she knows. She understands that climate change is real.
And she's one of a few dozen that admit it's real, say it's happening, and say something needs to be done now to address it. But she's in the minority as far as many Republicans on Capitol Hill.
Yes, absolutely. absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting, the Climate Solutions Caucus is now up to in the low 70s, 72, 74 members. When the NDAA was on the House floor, the National Defense Authorization Act for 2018, there was a proposal to take everything having to do with climate change out of it. And she rallied, I think 46 Republicans ended up voting against that amendment to take the climate-related wording out. And what that demonstrated was that we have enough people in the Climate Solutions Caucus now, Republicans, to create a blocking minority on climate issues.
She sits on the House Armed Services.
She does,
Committee.
And she chairs the Evolving Threats Committee.
At her town hall meeting in Mariah back on April 6th, one of the questions that came up was about national security. She acknowledged that that's how she looks at it, that she sees climate change as a real issue when it comes to national security.
Yes, the military as a whole sees it as being important. Sea levels rising, for example, in Norfolk, Virginia, there's flooding going on, and that's the largest naval base in the world. Those dry docks and other facilities, plus the places where people live around the base, people are having to leave their homes. That has to be dealt with. That's potentially a huge impact in the long run in the next few decades. Something people don't think about much is weather-related disasters. Our military response when a major typhoon hits the Philippines, for example, our Navy goes and helps. That's a drain. But perhaps the most direct thing is people are being displaced. The Syrian war really has its roots in climate change, a drought that forced farmers off their land and into the cities. And that's where the revolution began.
Political unrest that's being triggered by climate change.
Yes, absolutely. It's happening in Africa where the Sahara Desert is growing. It's expanding. And then you can also talk to displaced people about how this is America's fault, and that the United States is a huge producer of CO2, and that the United States is just basically giving the finger to the rest of the world and saying, we're not going to deal with it. So you can imagine the potential for whipping people up against us. That's another possibility.
And so a lot of people blame the U.S., and that could draw the U.S. into military conflicts.
Or terrorism directed against us.